So thank you all. I'm glad to see so many people made it after last night's party. It's wonderful that you're here. So my job today is to try to give you an overview from the perspective of a manufacturer. And to do that, the first thing that I need to do is to give you a little bit of the introduction as to who I am and what our story is. So it doesn't help you if I tell you my story and you don't know where we're coming from, because my story may not reflect yours. With that in mind, I know that there are a lot of people in the audience who are not from manufacturers, who are from regulators or hospitals, and I hope that maybe you'll find something also in this story for you, something that helps you understand maybe why we don't always respond exactly as you're expecting us to, why we have sometimes those extra barcodes on the packaging, and things like that. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about us, and then I'm going to go through the project that we executed, so our scope, how we defined our resources, and most importantly, our evaluation of the as-is versus where we wanted to go. We had to know where we were before we could get to where we wanted to be, which was not always easy. So who is BioMerieux? We are a medical device manufacturer, and we have about 10,000 employees now, and our sales are around 2 billion euros. So this makes us a mid-size manufacturer, small to mid-size in the IVD market. So we are primarily in vitro diagnostics in the microbiology space, but we also have another part of our business, which is industrial microbiology. So industrial microbiology is testing for food quality, pharma, things of this nature, and it becomes relevant later, not just trying to give you a sales pitch. It's so you can help understand some of the points that we made. We do sell in around 150 countries. 90% of our sales are now outside of France. We are a French-based company. This is important to us. And we have 19 what we call bioindustrial sites. So a bioindustrial site is simply a manufacturing site, to make it simple. The first thing we had to do was identify what was in the scope of our project. And this seemed so easy to me. So to give you a little bit of my story, I ended up in this project kind of by chance. I was at a point where I was changing roles, and my new boss said, "I've heard of this thing called UDI. It doesn't seem like a big deal. We think you can take it." And I said, "Why not? Sounds fun." That was about 5 years ago. I still have not escaped the UDI project. Maybe one day, I'm never sure. So within this, we had to define, well, what do we mean with the UDI project? So initially, the scope was the US. Slowly, that seemed to change, and we seemed to have to reflect on other things that were in that scope. And you can see the list of the things that were in our US project. And at the time I took it, the first scope was 2 products. And 2 products seemed very easy. Anybody can do 2 products. I thought, this is fine. We'll be okay. The next wave was a little harder. It was 250 products. But it was actually about halfway through those first 2 products that I realized we really had a problem. Because while we were somehow managing 2 products, in the time we had left to get to that 250, I knew we wouldn't get there. So pretty quickly, we had to recognize that this scope was not all it was cut out to be. And part of the reason I said we could do 2 products, you can manually separate 2 products, you can put them outside of your normal process. But when I looked at that list of 250 products, I realized that sometimes there were a dozen products that were made on the same manufacturing line as 300 other products. And I couldn't easily segregate that dozen products from that other 300. So that 250 products quickly became several thousand. It wasn't really 250. Now, in the complete scope of UDI, I only had 250 for Wave 2, but in reality, I had several thousand that had different pieces that had to be UDI compliant, in particular the labeling. And I'll come to that a little bit later and show it to you. We had to look, though, also then, what were the other priorities? Because at the same time, we started to get requests, as many of you know, from global purchasing organizations, from big customers, from other groups that said, well, we want something similar. So if you're going to go ahead and do this anyway, can you go ahead and do my product too? So little by little, we started adding to our scope as well these other commercial interests that weren't specifically regulatory interests. So scope creep is one of the worst things that can happen to you if you're managing a project. But each time there was somehow a valid reason to try to include these in the group. And so little by little, we kind of did. We also started to run into other compliance issues because the problem is when you start to go through UDI, you realize that it touches many, many things. And once you've identified that that thing that you're working on has other problems, you kind of have to address them at the same time. So we started to look at these other compliance issues that we had to work with, as well as the other conflicting projects that were there that we had to find a way to either change their timeline, change our timeline, or work together. And that became a really critical point of the project that we had. So at a certain point there, we also said, we need to stop and look at this, because if we're talking about UDI and we're talking about adding a GS1 barcode that's compliant, is there another interest in doing this? Because we're getting a lot of resistance to changing things. Is there another interest that we want to do that we need to start to sell within the company? And with the GS1 barcodes, what we quickly realized is this helped supply chain. Now, they had barcodes. They weren't compliant. They thought they had GS1 barcodes. And when I took those to our GS1 office to evaluate them, most of them were a grade F. I'm surprised they ever read them. And I've told the story before, but when I went to change and actually make those barcodes compliant, some of our supply chain couldn't read them anymore. So we went from these non-compliant barcodes that they were actually okay with to barcodes that other people could read that they couldn't anymore. So it creates some interesting connections. But it was at this point that we decided that those products that were industrial, that weren't actually in the scope of the UDI regulation, should also be included at least in the labeling portions of our product. So I went from having, again, like I said, this group of products that were clinical, that were maybe a couple hundred, to several thousand to include also those industry products that were going through the same manufacturing line and the same supply chain. The next thing I had to do was try to build the team. So again, I was told this is a very nice small project. It's just UDI. It should be fine. Should be relatively easy. And I very quickly realized that that was, again, a little bit of an underestimation. So at a certain point in time, we realized we had nearly every function in our company that had to be involved in this product, whether it was from data management, from purchasing, from regulatory. At a certain point, we needed HR because we had to change the responsibilities and we had to deal with training and trying to build something that didn't exist. And that's not always easy. And so a big part of our work was just trying to do the change management and the cultural adaptation within this group. So within this company, we had to suddenly get them to understand that there was something happening and they needed to be aware of it and they needed to be on board. So the point that was very critical was to get executive support and to get the budget that we needed. So what started as a tiny project ended up with a budget that was in the many millions. And at a certain point, I lost track of being able to add up how many because we had to split it up. So we ended up breaking it into these executive groups, these groups that really had an expertise somewhere to try to address the bits and the pieces so that at the end we could all come together. So we put a steering committee together at a high level with our executive team to say we need to make sure that we have something coherent and something that works together at the end, but we also need people to focus on the parts that matter. Labeling is one area, and it's one area of expertise. Data management is another one, and it's absolutely critical. And there's so much activity that it was impossible to do this out of one team with one leader. So one of the things we had to do early was make sure that we had the right people, the right task force, the right expertise, and the right connections outside of our company to help us every time we hit those challenges that we didn't know how to address. Because there were many of them, and there still are, and there will be more. I still don't know exactly what we're going to do with basic DI, but we'll find something and we'll get there. So we had to assess our as-is to know where we were going. So one of the big things that we were looking at in particular was our equipment and our systems. So we had to look at our labeling software and our printers. Were they capable of doing what we were going to ask them to do? We had to look at data management. Did we have the data in electronic form? Was it on paper on somebody's desk? Was it something that we could use, and was it the right quality? We had to look at supply chain, their capabilities and their process. And like I said, we thought they were scanning these barcodes. What they were really scanning was something else, was something non-standard. It worked for them, but it wasn't going to work for anybody else. So we had to look at that as well. And we had to get barcode verifiers. Nobody had ever verified the barcodes. This was something that just was foreign to them. They said, well, but if I can scan it, it's fine. Well, not exactly. So trying to convince them that just scanning wasn't enough was another set of challenges. What I found is we had a little bit of everything. Like I said, we have 19 different sites around the world. 19 different sites with more than 19 different sets of practices. So sometimes each manufacturing line had created their own thing to do. So we had systems that were very out of date. I found one software package used on several main sites that hadn't been supported since 2006. Not created in 2006, it hadn't been supported by the manufacturer since 2006. So they were literally running these old PCs with this old operating system so they could run their labeling software. I said, I think we're gonna have to change that. No, it works fine. Don't touch it. Okay, well, we'll see what we can do. We found some sites that were actually manually hand stamping the expiration dates. They had a nice stamp. You turned it and you stamped it. I don't think we can do that for the barcodes. Are you sure? I'm pretty sure, but we'll check. We couldn't hand stamp the barcodes, just in case anybody was wondering. It's not really possible. Our GTIN attribution, we already did have GTINs. We were lucky that we were already with GS1, so we didn't have that change. And our attribution was mostly correct, except that I had to convince them to stop attributing a GTIN to every product that came through, because they did it regardless of whether it was ours or not, and regardless of whether it had someone else's or not. We fixed that. It's okay now. So from there, we also had to look at where we were in terms of the people and the procedures. So it was mentioned yesterday in one of the breakout sessions that you have to look at your quality management system. And again, UDI touches everything. We had a huge number of procedures to go through and update and figure out how are we going to put UDI in there? Whether it was labeling, whether it was complaint management, how are we going to capture UDI and make sure that all of these 10,000 people who are going to now see this thing understand what it is? We did create an e-learning so that we could deploy it easily to everyone. It was 20 minutes, very high level. For our company, we did it in French and in English because we captured most people that way with one of the two languages. And we made that a mandatory part of their learning, their introduction. It's only 20 minutes, but it makes them understand what this is and why it's important. And like I said, implementing a change like this and trying to get people to do what you're asking them to do is not just about the technical aspect of the change. It's really about making sure that the behaviors support the change you're trying to make. And that was a big part of our challenge. So now all of our corporate procedures include UDI when it's appropriate, and we've made sure that they are all there to support the process in its totality. And not just, we have a bit in labeling, we have a bit in data management, we have a bit somewhere else, but really looking at a global process and a global approach. I think I skipped. The data. So the data was a big challenge. So I don't know how many of you have companies that have been around for a long time. Ours is roughly 50 years old, a little bit more. It was amazing the number of people who had binders on their desk with some of the key data. A lot of it hadn't made it into an electronic system. A lot of the things we needed now were scattered in different systems, in different formats. It was amazing just trying to get people to understand that we have to talk the same language. We have to define this the same way. Things like temperatures. We had a field in our ERP for temperature, and we thought, okay, this should be fine. It's temperature. How wrong can we get it? Well, apparently, pretty wrong. So what we found was that actually, within that same temperature field, even though it seemed obvious, different people had decided to use it for different things. So in one case, it was the temperature that's printed on the label that's for the user. In another case, it was the logistics temperature, the area they wanted it stored in the warehouse when it transited through the warehouse. Well, those are both legitimate things. Hopefully they're compatible. Most cases they were. But you have to come up with a decision as a company and say, okay, what are we going to use this field for, and do we all agree? So I had in the end 21 different impacted sites with no central data repository, no way to synchronize that data electronically, and worse, a totally different set of rules. So again, it came down to a lot of culture change that we had to try to put together. We identified early that we would need help, so we did choose a provider. So in our case, we chose One World Sync to help us go through the synchronization phase. And then we also realized, even with that, we're not ready right away for UDI. So we had this great plan that we were going to use the GDSN right away up front, and we didn't quite make it. So we had to step back and say, okay, we know that's what we want to do eventually. We know we want to get there. In the meantime, we're probably going to have to do some manual data entry because we're not ready and our systems are not ready. So now we're working on implementing that master data management tool so that we can work nicely with One World Sync so that we can go through the GDSN and eventually have this synchronization in place. But we had to break our project down into the really short term, the immediate need, which turned out to be a manual entry that we could manage, and the mid to long term needs to have something that was more automated and more synchronized. Our labels were a huge challenge for us, and it's everything from the physical label support to the equipment that you're printing it with, the software you're designing it with, all the way including the final product that you have to inspect. So there's all sorts of different supports, all sorts of different formats, but we had to be able to print barcodes on them. And what I found is that we had more than 15,000 labels. All of them were individual files. So more than 15,000 individual files in different formats around the world, because we have a lot of products with smaller labels on the insides of the boxes and things. And there was no standardization. There was no repository. Even to get the count of labels was next to impossible and involved us literally counting files, which is a kind of a frustrating task at a certain moment when you think, well, we should just have this. We should know this information, and we really didn't. So there was a huge culture change that was necessary at that point. We said, we can't do this like this. We cannot go from an artisanal, individual labeling to something that's automated, to something that is standardized, without a pretty big shift and a re-education of the people involved. And that was something that, for me, was really one of the most interesting parts of the project. So I'm going to show you a couple examples, just to give you some ideas of the things that should seem simple, but are not. Because I heard a lot from my manager, but you're just adding a barcode. How hard can it be? Well, it can be pretty complicated, actually. So this is actually a primary container label. So this is not our shipping or even our unit of sales. And what you have on the left is our historic label. So if you can see, the picture's a little hard to read because it's very shiny. For anyone who's done barcodes, very shiny doesn't work very well. It's not great. And you can also see the quality of the printing. That is a dot matrix with big dots. You couldn't even print symbols, so that CE mark's not a really good CE mark even. Not sure how we got away with it for as many years as we did, but we did. So this was what I was going into, and they said, no, but make it work, because this equipment's expensive, because it was all integrated. This was the pouching equipment for this product. They said, we don't want to have to redo any sort of studies. We have 275 products coming off that line. Don't touch my line. Okay. So we looked at it, and we looked at different options. We said, well, can we put a label on top of it? Can we have them stick a label over it? That didn't work. So what are we going to do? And at the end, what we had to do was really change the whole thing. We had to change the pouch. We had to change the packaging, which meant we impacted stability. We had to prove that the stability was still okay. It was not fun. And I think anybody who's had to do those kinds of things will recognize that was not a good day for me. When I had to go to them and say, no, we really don't have another option. We're going to have to change this line. This is not going to work otherwise. So we ended up with a new material. So this base is now white. It's still a little bit reflective, but because the base is now white, we can actually print a barcode that reads with a good quality. And we completely automated that system. So now it's a completely different line. But this was a new manufacturing installation. It was a huge installation. It impacted the site in a way that I can't even begin to explain to you, and put hundreds of people to work and created supply issues for a little bit because we had to convert from one line to another, and these are lines that are bigger than this room. So you don't have space to put multiple in. Here's an example where we have that second barcode. And this was an example where I had to sell to them that I wasn't just putting something in just for compliance and because we have to. What we had also for this line was that sometimes they'd have to rip open these packages to do inspection because they had no way to track what was inside the pouch over here. Not in a detailed way anyway. They had a couple numbers, but it wasn't really working for them. This barcode now lets them do a quality control without opening the package, which means they get to save a lot of products. So we're saving hundreds of thousands of products per year that otherwise we would have had to destroy in testing because they were able to put extra information via a barcode that wasn't possible before. So it wasn't just a UDI compliance at the end. We said, if we're going to change the line, we're going to make it useful also for the manufacturing site, and that's what we did. So at the end, they're extremely happy with this project, and it was all their idea. So we're glad because now they have a new line, and it wasn't UDI's fault. This is another label. I'm extremely proud of that label on top. How many of you can read it? This is my favorite. I use this quite often. So when I started in the labeling group, it's not my background. I saw this label and I said, you have to be kidding me. Nobody's going to read that. They can't. It's tiny. It's awful. So when it came to time, and you see we did have a sort of GS1 barcode there, split into two pieces. It's way too small, actually, to be compliant. It wasn't really readable. But we said, we're going to change this. We're going to touch it for UDI. Let's actually fix it. Let's make it useful for the customers again. So we simplified with much pain around the world because we had to explain to several regulatory authorities why we were taking this text off the label and why it was okay and how we would survive anyway. And that's what we did. And at the end, we were able to come up with something that's much more simple, much more straightforward, and much easier for people to read in order to implement UDI. So for us, our UDI codes, this is at a packaging level for the sales unit, is a data matrix. It includes our GTIN, our date of manufacturing, and our lot number. And as was mentioned actually in the last presentation, you see that we have the date of manufacturing right here on the label. That's not part of our production control, so it's not in our UDI. And this was a decision we made very early on. It's there because we have a lot of countries like India, like China, who need the date of manufacturing to import on their label. And it's a lot of work for them to get it when it's not on that main label. So we've implemented it everywhere. But we never did include it in the UDI, and the FDA was okay with that as well, because we're able to explain that that's not production information. So just to summarize our key lessons, this is a maze, and the complexity is there. So in order to achieve the goal, in order to get to where we need to go with UDI, we know that it's going to be a long road, and we know there's going to be a lot of steps. So you have to break it down and make it simple. Break it down into the steps that make sense. Simplify your life as much as possible and set the short-term goals so that you can get where you need to be. Make sure that you have all of the right people engaged from the beginning and recognize that a lot of the work is not really the technical part. That you can figure out. It's the culture change that's necessary to get people to understand why you're doing it and what it means. Because if you can convince them this is the right thing to do, that it has value, then you can make it. Then you can get there in the end. If you're fighting that part, you won't get very far. No matter what the system is that you have in place, no matter how great you have your technology set out, if you don't have the people with you and if people don't understand why, a lot of times you're not going to make it. Whenever it's possible, harmonize. Like I said early in the presentation, we decided that UDI, non-UDI, whatever it is, if we're putting a barcode on that label, if that label is going through our supply chain, it's going to be the same barcode. It's going to be a GS1 data matrix. That is the standard. UDI or not, that's what you get. And it makes everybody's life easier. At the end, you really have to try to make this an opportunity rather than an obligation. It is an obligation. We have to do it. We have to do it now. It's happening in the US, it's happening in Europe, it's happening elsewhere in the world. It's not something that we can not do. We don't have the choice. But if you can convince also that there is an opportunity there, if you can convince the management, your employees, and your customers that this is much more than an obligation, this is really an opportunity, whether it's to clean up those old labels with 14 languages that nobody can read, whether it's to change that old packaging line that really wasn't going to meet the needs, or whether it's just to have a better opportunity, a better system that's more reliable, that's more efficient in terms of supply chain, and that's more secure for the patients. This is an opportunity, and that's how we should treat it. So with that said, I want to thank you very much for listening to me. I could talk for hours, but I've promised them to only talk for 25 minutes, and I think I'm right at the end of my time. So do not hesitate to contact me if you have any questions, either during the coffee break or by email. Enjoy the rest of the day.